So good morning, everyone. My name is Ian Gary. I'm the director of the Power and Money program at Oxfam here in Washington, D.C. We have a great panel to follow up the first panel. I wanted to note that it's been 5 years since we had a similar conference on oil in East Africa with the Brookings Institute, and getting to the point that many made about expectations and timing. I think in 2014 we were discussing imminent oil in Uganda and Kenya and other countries, and a lot of that has not come to pass. In fact, some of these projects have stalled, such as in Uganda. So I think one of the main points that was raised in terms of expectations and timing has really come to pass. If you look at the discussion from 2014 and where we are now in 2019 with many of those countries. I won't summarize what we heard from the last panel. Isabel did a great job. I do want to make a few remarks about what's embedded in the title here around inequality, and inequality really being at the center of our discussion today about extractive industries. Inequality of information and power is something that came out very strongly in this panel and is at the heart of these industries. The inequality between companies and states in terms of their capacities, their information asymmetry, their ability to engage in negotiations, inequality between those states and their own citizens is something that we heard come out very clearly. And addressing this inequality of information and power is key to addressing other inequalities. The bad deals that we discussed, the inequality of benefits between elites and poor populations. As Barnaby noted, the lost revenues just from one oil block is equal to 2 times the health and education budget of Nigeria. Inequality between urban populations and project-affected communities, between indigenous populations and non-indigenous. Inequality between women and men in terms of who accrues benefits and who suffers the most harm from these projects. Inequalities of human rights. We haven't really talked about the process that communities should be able to access regarding free, prior, and informed consent. So those kinds of inequalities, I think, are key to the extractive sector. Inequality of voice and civic space. This came out in terms of Danny's remarks in the opening. I hope this kind of inequality will be discussed in our panel today. And then most importantly, how we use some of this data, and we have experiences that have been shared to address inequality in these countries. So for example, in the case of Ghana, where Oxfam has been working for years with partners, we supported a campaign on oil for agriculture, was successful in directing more money from oil into the types of projects that benefit smallholder farmers in Ghana and addressing those types of inequalities. So we have a great panel this morning. We're hoping to reflect on some of the lessons that we learned from the morning, but also, more importantly, to take a step up to think about some of the broader issues and broader directions from a variety of perspectives, from an investor perspective, from a donor perspective, from a African government perspective, from a research and think tank perspective. So without further ado, I'd like to kick it off with Ambassador Yansane. Welcome. Guinea is obviously a resource-rich country developing major projects. If you could speak to us about how you see the value of transparency and accountability in terms of Guinea's own path towards sustainable development and economic growth. How are these transparency and accountability initiatives, whether it's Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, more of the homegrown efforts that are underway in terms of contract disclosure, how are these steps viewed inside Guinea, and how do you view their importance? I'm giving 5 minutes to each panelist in the opening.
Okay. Thank you very much. I would like to start by expressing my appreciation for the invitation to this very interesting gathering on the very important topics, natural resources. I do believe that the issue of governance has to be combined also with the issue of capacity. In our countries, we have both problems, governance and capacity. When I say capacity, it's not only human capacity, but it's also institutional capacity. If the capacity is missing, then we have this asymmetry of information between companies and our countries. And this is create a big gap in expectation and, unfortunately, the outcome of the project. In the case of Guinea, I may say that we have two periods. The period before 2011 and the current period. Before 2011, we had a standalone project without any reference to any mining code. This project were negotiated in some sort of black box, and unfortunately, the country did not get much profit from that kind of negotiation. As a result, corruption was there. Corruption was there, and we had huge problem with mining called Simandou. This is one of the biggest untapped iron ore mining in the world. And when we arrived in power in 2011, there was an audit, and we discovered that there was corruption. So our government decided to impose a penalty on the company. This is Rio Tinto, and Rio Tinto paid 700 million penalty to retain its mining right. So this is where capacity also is coming in. What to do with this 700 million US dollar? Some people said we should put it in the budget and then spend it right away. Fortunately, wisdom prevailed, and we decided to create some sort of development fund to fund infrastructure for the country, not for the consumption, but infrastructure. And that was very useful because for, let's say, 5 years, we could use this fund to finance our infrastructure project, roads, dams. We contracted one hydro dam with this fund. So this is one aspect. The other aspect is the fact that today we have decided to create safeguard from community level to the parliament to ensure that at every level everybody is fully informed about the project. And finally, I think it's creating a good outcome. Everybody is aware of what is happening. The level of community, we have created committee of monitoring the project. And the government had decided to actually give 15% of the mining proceed to the communities. Of course, communities has to develop their own development program. Not easy because the capacity problem also is there. And we have to make sure that some peoples at the community level are not going to hijack that 15% of revenue. At central level, we have not only the Minister of Mining, but Minister of Finance, Minister of Transportation, Minister of Intel Territory. So it's some sort of broad committee in charge of monitoring what's happening in mining area. Because we learn lessons from the past, now we're trying to make sure that from now on, everything will be transparent. But we still have challenges in terms of capacity, because even if you work with a lawyer, you have to pay the lawyer. So we decided to review all bad past deals. We have to find resources to pay these lawyers. So fortunately, the ADB, the African Development Bank, put in place what we call African Legal Facility, and this helped Guinea to provide resources to this law firm. And that was really wonderful. Now, the question is how to review contracts that are supposed to be binding between the two parties. We had to do it because we have to create some sort of level playing field in the system. Otherwise, the previous contract were really, really very bad for the country, but also for new companies. So it took time. It took 3 to 4 years, but finally we had a very good outcome for this review, and we had a new mining code that's learned lessons, and now this mining code is supposed to be at the level of international standards. So today, I may say that really we have a very sound legal framework, but the capacity problem is there. Infrastructure problems also are there because we have to get the mining from mountains to the seaside, and we have to find resources to fund infrastructure. So one of the solutions is to have the system of sharing infrastructure. But this is one way, but I'm not sure that it could bring the solution to all the system. The other issue of capacity is that the EITI is there, but the EITI is only at the bottom of the process. But what is happening upward, we don't have any control. We don't have control on the cost of the project. We don't have control on transfer pricing. So the capacity issue is still a problem for Guinea, let alone environment. Because we used to export 15 million tons of bauxite. Today, we're exporting 60 million tons of bauxite. This has a lot of impact on rural communities and is creating a lot of frustration, a lot of problems. So these are some of the problems. So we are coming a long way, but still we have challenges.
Great, thanks. Ashok, you come from an investor perspective and are with the Emerging Markets Investor Alliance. So I'm interested in hearing, both reactions from the first panel from an investor perspective, but also the value that you see in terms of these transparency and accountability efforts. How does that help you from an investment point of view make decisions, analyze risks? The kinds of stories that were coming out about major companies like Shell and Eni and the fact that they're under criminal investigation in different jurisdictions obviously would seem to be like a material issue for investors. But obviously there are other dimensions of this discussion that are of interest to investors. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, sure. And just a word for those who may not be familiar with the organization I represent. The Emerging Markets Investors Alliance is, we represent institutional investors who invest in publicly traded stocks and bonds in emerging markets. They invest in companies as well as in governments through government bonds. And as a group of institutional investors, we engage finance ministry officials and corporate executives about how they can advance transparency and sustainability in emerging markets on a range of issues, including oil and mining transparency, beneficial ownership, tax transparency, environmental issues, and human rights issues. In response to Ian's kind of request, the main point that I want to make is that institutional investors do care very much about transparency in the oil and mining sector. First reason for this is that our clients care. So asset managers get money to invest from pension funds. And the pension funds, in particular those in Europe, care very much that their asset managers are advancing sustainability and good governance in the companies and governments in which they invest. The reason that pension funds in Europe in particular care is that they have a very long-term time horizon. They're looking to pay back pensioners in 20, 30, 40 years' time. So they want to make sure that the investments are around then and that they're productive. And so, so they've been pushing asset managers to focus on what's called ESG investing, or environmental social governance investing, taking into account ESG factors in our investment decisions and advocating for better practices. So that's the first reason investors care. The second reason that this issue of oil and mining transparency is important to investors is that the oil and mining sector is a significant part of our investable universe. So over 25% of the emerging market corporate bond universe is comprised of metals and mining companies and of oil and gas companies. About 15% of the emerging market equity universe is comprised of materials and energy stocks. And about 60% of the emerging market sovereign debt universe is comprised of countries that export oil and mining products. So it's an important part of what we invest in. We can't avoid investing in these companies and these governments. A third reason why transparency in the extractive sector is important for us is that it affects the valuations of the stocks and bonds that we invest in. I'll give a few examples of that. First of all, we, in collaboration with some of our partners, including Oxfam, did a study of the oil company Tullow. And we found that 10% fluctuation in the remittances that Tullow paid to governments resulted in a 7% move in the company's valuation, or in the stock price. And this factor of Tullow's payments to remittances was the fourth most important factor affecting the stock price. So that's one example. Second example would be is this case of Nigeria, which lost $16 billion of its oil revenues back in 2016. So that figure, $16 billion, is quite large, obviously. And from an investor's perspective, it's also, even though we're investing billions of dollars, that in hundreds of billions of dollars, that figure is also large. So that $16 billion represents 40% of Nigeria's foreign currency reserves today. And foreign currency reserves is an important indicator of a country's solvency and its ability to repay its debt. Mm-hmm. So, and in particular, in countries with fixed exchange rates like Nigeria, we expect a very high level of foreign exchange reserves in order to ensure that the country can maintain its fixed exchange rate. So in the case of Nigeria, for example, foreign exchange reserves would factor into an indicator that we look at called import cover, which is basically the months of imports that a country can earn from its foreign exchange reserves. If suddenly we're unable to earn any more dollar revenues, if there were an economic crisis or what have you, how long can it, how many months can it continue to finance its imports if it weren't earning any dollars? And for Nigeria, that number is currently 6, which is it's okay for a country that has a fixed exchange rate, but not great. But if Nigeria had that $16 billion, that number would rise to around 10, which is quite strong. So it makes a difference in our assessment of the creditworthiness of a country like Nigeria in this case. And then third example would be that in an economic crisis, when there is a lack of transparency in the oil and mining sector or in general, investors always assume the worst. And I really liked what Elvin said in the previous panel. I just wrote down his quotation, which I'll use again, I'm sure. It's often worse than you thought it was, he said. And investors just assume that it is worse than everyone thinks when there's no transparency. So we'll price in the worst. Interest rates will be high, stock prices will be low, and it'll be very difficult during that time for governments or companies to raise additional capital, even if they need it very badly, which is typically when they need it the most, during a crisis. So So these are some of the reasons that investors value transparency. One other comment is, that again, in response to the previous panel, where we talked about a number of scandals that affect in the oil and mining sector. Scandals very much affect stock and bond prices and are of great concern to investors. The Petrobras bribery scandal, over the course of 2 years, brought the price of Petrobras's 10-year bond down about 40%. And its yields have hovered between 10 to 16% for several years, though they have come down a bit since then. So the financing costs for Brazil are obviously much higher because of a scandal, of that scandal. Brazil's equity market during that period dropped about 35%, and a firm, Capital Economics, estimated that scandal shaved 1 to 2.5% from Brazil's GDP growth in 2015 and 2016. And so changes like that to GDP growth, to stock and bond valuations, very much are obviously important to investors' views of the country fundamentals as well as of our investments in stocks and bonds. And of course, there's in South Africa, the Gupta scandal clearly had an impact on stock and bond valuations and investors' willingness to invest in South Africa and at the price at which we would invest. And all of these kinds of scandals just make it much more expensive for governments and companies to raise money. And we demand a higher cost of capital. So it very much affects our view, and it affects the fundamentals of these companies and governments. Maybe a quick reaction to the case studies that were referenced in the previous panel and that are in the report. Nigeria, for every dollar that Nigeria earns for its budget, it pays 27 cents of that dollar towards interest payments, which is a very high proportion. Other countries with similar credit ratings to Nigeria pay only about 9%. So supposing that Nigeria had, almost $6 billion of lost revenues that were referenced in the Nigeria case study, that ratio of 27 cents on the dollar would come down to 24 cents on the dollar, so about 10% difference, which is quite significant and really frees up space for Nigeria, from an investor's perspective, to have more flexibility to repay the debt that we buy. In the case of Mozambique, another case study, the net external debt of Mozambique compared to its GDP is about almost 400%, which is an enormous figure for external debt to be that high. Gabon, for example, has a figure of 40%. Ghana, that figure is 60%, and in Zambia, it's 100%. And clearly, LNG revenues could, over time, help to bring down very, very bad debt ratios like that. So with that, I'll just reiterate the point that investors care very much. It's in our interest to have transparency in the oil and mining sector. It affects us from our clients want it, us to incorporate or advocate for transparency. It's important in the way we value stocks and bonds. And no one wants to get caught in a scandal, and certainly, there are plenty of those in this sector. So, thank you.
Thanks, Ashok. It's certainly gratifying to know that not only is this a concern for civil society, but it's a hardcore business decision concern for investors. So I'd want to hand it over to Vera from the Ford Foundation. Vera, you've had the privilege, as it were, to be at a field level view as a grant maker over the last several years. So I was very interested in hearing your reflections on what you heard, how that resonates with some of the lessons that you're drawing from this natural resource governance field. What's working, and what do you think we need to emphasize going forward?
Thank you, Ian. A pleasure to be here. And I found the first panel very activating and stimulating. In terms of the reflections and what resonated with me, obviously all of it, to say bluntly, in terms of how the Ford Foundation views this work on natural resource governance, some of the key issues that came up in conversation, so for example, the issue about state capture, that is an issue that we are grappling with and are looking to invest more deeply in, particularly because even though you have the data and you have the best practice and you have the policies in place, if you have a capture, as we saw in the case of South Africa that like Ashok just referenced, you're still going to be stuck. And so if this is a global phenomenon, if state capture is a global phenomenon, what are the things that we can do? What are the things we should be paying more attention to? The issue of civic space and the consequence that civil society activists pay sometimes in terms of dying for these causes, being imprisoned frequently for raising the alarm around these issues is one that the foundation pays close attention to. And so in terms of our part, besides supporting civil society activism, we want to increase our role in raising the political costs around the threats that are paid to civil society. And we partner with many people in the room around thinking what that means going forward. I was also very struck by the examples I think Dawn had mentioned in terms of the consequences of revenue, not just in terms of revenue foregone, but when you have cases where the revenue forecasting is so bad, is so poorly made, and the choices that are made accordingly in terms of increasing sovereign debt. And we're frankly dealing with that right now. So a lot of the conversations that I'm part of, that we see across countries is the issue of the failure of domestic resource mobilization, and therefore because of this cost of debt. So even if countries are being forced to raise more revenue, it's going towards debt servicing. It's not going towards meeting the social and developmental needs that people have. And so even as we call on governments to raise revenue, it's not going towards the things that we care about. And so what does that mean in terms of what we should be focusing on and how do we position ourselves, especially because as I think a few of the panelists said in the earlier session, even as we move to a just transition, extraction will still be a fact of life for a lot of our countries, particularly those countries that produce precious minerals that will be increasingly important as we transition away from fossil fuels. So I'm very struck by that, and I'm, again, Mariati's work in terms of the analysis, making the link between revenue and expenditure also resonates with what we're looking at, because we focus on benefit sharing as part of our strategy. And what that means is not just focusing on how much revenue we're raising, but in terms of the intergovernmental fiscal transfers, how does the revenue we're raising reduce inequality in real terms for the countries that we focus on? I will just say not with my Ford hat. So I also think that the issue of intergovernmental fiscal transfers is so critical because the other option that we tend to focus on is corporate social responsibility. And while that is a nice thing to have, we must never forget it's also a tax deductible cost for companies. And so in some ways we are subsidizing their development, which falls on governments then to, in the long term, to cover those costs. So if I had a preference in terms of looking at benefit sharing, intergovernmental fiscal transfers, I think is where we need to be. Just two more points I wanted to make in terms of the things that I didn't hear about, which give me pause and are things that I worry about, are issues around fiscal stability. So insofar as we talk about we need the contracts, we need to understand what's happening at the project level and so forth. Even with all of this analysis, if those contracts have fiscal stability terms that freeze the terms of those fiscal terms for some, in some cases forever. I've seen contracts where you can never shift out of that regardless. And for many countries, it's between 20 and 30 years. So even if you change your legal regime, it's always a prospective contracts that are must comply. But those that exist, those are subsisting. Countries are unable to grapple with that. So unless we have to, look at some extreme countries where they simply unilaterally terminate contracts, and that's a political issue with its own costs. And I don't know if we should be advocating for that. So I just wonder, what do we do with fiscal stability as a community? And besides thinking, okay, well, we messed up here, but going forward, we should do better. How do we do with those subsisting contracts that have fiscal stability? And that's something I think governments as well, even when they want to do better, their hands are tied. So I'm curious about what we think about and if there's suggestions from the floor. Another thing I didn't hear about is the impact of digitalization on this sector. So I was recently at a Pan-African conference on illicit financial flows and taxation that was hosted by some of our partners, Tax Justice Network Africa, Trust Africa, and the African Union and UNECA. And one of the issues that came up there was the promise of blockchain. So I know I've been in many discussions with my colleagues who are much more expert in technology than I am, where they've said, well, blockchain is simply ledger, so bad information in, bad information out. But in this conference, I was struck by a tech expert who said, actually, there are controls that can be built into it because of the very nature of blockchain. And I wonder if this is something that we can experiment with, because one of the things that came up in the first panel was this issue of patience. These cases take 7 years before they come online, and even then we don't know, and the timing and so forth. And so if we can explore the opportunity and the promise of blockchain, would that in fact cut down the time so we don't have to be as patient in terms of the revenue collection and analyzing that data and so forth? And at the same time, the other issue is what are the costs of digitalization in extractives? A lot of the focus in conversation around taxation is usually around tech companies and how most of the services now, because a lot of that work is in intangibles, how are we taxing those e-commerce and frankly tech companies? But the truth is digitalization affects all sectors, and it certainly is affecting extractive sectors as well. And I'm curious about how we're thinking about the intersections and interactions between digitalization, that's being a fact, it's coming on board, what aspects of these extractive industries are being automated, and what is the implication from a revenue perspective, given that revenues is the primary and most and foremost benefit that governments have. And the other thing I'll say, I think my colleague, our ambassador here, had said earlier, is that just recognizing that government capacity is also very weak. It's not always true that governments don't do better because they are willfully ignorant about it. It's just that they also don't know. So how are we including them in our conversations around capacity building and in these conversations? The last thing I'll point is in response to, I think one of our colleagues from the floor had mentioned how are we dealing with this issue about transparency and perception? And this relates again to the issues around the global economy of some of the issues that we're talking about. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, Ashok, because one of the foremost prevailing narratives that I always come across is this issue of taxes being a cost on business. And that's reinforced by, for example, the World Bank's annual Doing Business Guide, where they literally rank countries according to the number of taxes that must be statutorily paid by companies. And therefore, that creates an incentive for governments, if they are very high ranked as being countries that have lots of taxes that have to be paid by companies, to reduce the number of taxes. That measurement completely ignores the actual burden of those taxes. And so you'll find that even though the statutory liability is on a company to pay that tax, if you look at the actual burden, the economic incidence of that tax, it's often on citizens. And so I'm curious about how we deal with that narrative about tax being cost on business, coupled with the fact that in Africa, companies are also seen as being the highest taxpayers. And so we build in this implicit desire to minimize taxes because it's harmful, it's not seen as being business friendly, and our economies, which are supposed to be private sector led, the way to invite investors, the way to invite development is by one of the tools you do is you reduce your taxes. And so how does that sit with this conversation that we're having, where we recognize that many of our countries, particularly in Africa, are resource rich. And so it is a fact that we rely on these sectors to raise revenues, but then we're also told that we need to reduce those taxes because the investors won't come in the first place. And how do we square that circle when revenue is so critical? So I'll leave it at that. So many other places we could go, but thank you again for that.
Yeah, those are all, I think, great points and great provocations. And the last point in terms of tax competition and a race to the bottom is not only an issue in Africa, but globally. It's something that the OECD and others are looking at very closely, whether we'll make global progress in terms of a minimum corporate income tax rate. That remains to be seen. But I know that in West Africa, for example, ECOWAS has been looking at, can you set a sort of a floor for royalty rates. So in terms of, say, gold mining, Mali and Burkina Faso and Ghana are not competing with each other in terms of a race to the bottom. So I hope that and other questions we can get to in the discussion. But I'd like to turn to Landry Signet, who's a fellow at Brookings African Growth Initiative. From your vantage point, from this sort of think tank and research perspective, what are some of the things that you drew from this panel, but also how do they relate to some of your own research interests? I know that domestic resource mobilization is something that you're looking at quite closely. There's a lot of, I would say, attention in Africa on how do you meet this financing gap to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. A lot of countries now are turning to the extractive sector as a strategy, whether that's realistic or not. And a lot of the companies themselves are sort of embracing the Sustainable Development Goals and saying that they're contributing to it by being those companies that are extracting minerals. So if you have any thoughts on those two things.
Excellent, thank you very much. I would first like to congratulate the first panel. So that was an outstanding presentation. So I will discuss perhaps the 9 to 10 lessons learned while comparing them with the work that we are doing. So to begin with, I want to mention that at the Africa Growth Initiative, we have one of our core areas is financing for development, led by our director, Dr. Brahima Koulibaly, and who deeply believe that we have much more resources, domestic resources on the continent than what we are mobilizing now, and an optimal extraction of those resources will bring us a long way in terms of progress in achieving development outcomes. So one of the things, and I think was mentioned in the previous panel, is the question of getting the political economy right. We often know what the solutions are. However, there is still a gap between the specific solution that we have and the implementation outcome. So, and this is related to accountable governance overall. I'll come back to that point. So, lesson number 1, quality and accessibility of data. So, in our work at identifying the potential of natural resource sectors, including oil and gas. For oil and gas, we have more data than we have for the mining sector. So one of the previous panelists said that we may not need to speak or to continue speaking about data, but knowledge. But I think data remain critical. We have many data sets from the World Bank Wealth of Nations. We have NRGI, which is providing a great insight, IMF, and many other sources. However, it is not, it has been difficult, and I hope some of you may have the answer, to really find and quantify the endowment in natural resources of specific countries beside oil and gas. So in the oil and gas sector, it is closer, we are closer to the reality, but in the broader mining sector, it is still difficult to really assess the potential, including in the World Bank Wealth of Nations report. So they have some estimate, but we have a gap there. So the second point is independence and quality of analysis. I think this is extremely important also. And we see that good work has been done in Malawi, for example, in Indonesia. However, it is important to provide really independent evidence-based insights coming obviously from think tanks, academia, among other, which are independent and which are really committed to achieve the overall public good versus having vested interest. Ultimately, we need everyone, the contribution of all the actors, the private sector, the government in one order, but it's extremely important to also have those independent voices in a comparative perspective, not just in a given project or in a given country, but to what extent do we perform better than other countries in similar conditions. So a third point is the inclusion of civil society organization in the informal processes. And so we often speak about public-private partnership, but I'll probably instead speak about public-private civil society organization partnerships. So it's really important to be involved in the process. And I really like the Malawian perspective of not being overly confrontational at providing data, and from there discussing and engaging with different parts, including the government, to find common solutions. I think it is easier to achieve a better performance than simply challenging everything the government does. So a fourth point, we spoke about open and accountable management in the broader oil, gas, and mining sectors with a focus on collaboration. I would say that horizontal and diagonal accountability are important here. And when I speak about horizontal accountability, I mean the checks and balance process between the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature. So independently of the type of government, if the judiciary is not doing its work, corruption will remain. We spoke about extraction and the capture, government capture. So it's extremely important for the judiciary to do its work. And to help achieving that goal, what we call diagonal accountability is important. So the accessibility of the information which will inform the public debate, including involving civil society organizations and the media. So for the judiciary to do its work, information should get out, and the problem should be political. So it is not just a technical problem. So, and as noted by Ambassador, we also have the notion of effective legislation. So it's critical to have effective legislation, even if government do not implement them all the time. But the basis, the fact of having an effective legislation will help improve processes and will serve as a basis for engagement, for discussion, and different reports, which ultimately would improve the outcome. But the effective legislation is not just about legal processes. I think it should also be about human capital and resources to monitor for successful implementation of the legislation. So we have the process, but we also have the human capital. So the sixth point is related to optimal revenue generation. What is a fair deal? So we were speaking about, even before corruption, so government should first know what the first deal could constitute. Of course, some studies by IMF are estimated to 65 to 85% of the rent in the oil sector for government and 40 to 60% in the mining sector. So that is the overall ideal goals. However, in reality, including for countries such as the United States, the average is between 45 to 65% for oil and 35 to 45% for the broader mining sector. So the lessons learned are not just for African countries, for developing economies, they are also for advanced economy. And that's why it's important to compare overall. So now, once we have generated enough revenue, we have the question of revenue sharing and broader management. So to what extent can we ensure an generational management of resources? To what extent the revenue generated will help improving the human development or sustainable development goals in general now, or while doing so, ensuring that the next generation will also be able to benefit from those non-renewable resources. Of course, we have some states here, including Alaska, which have the Alaska Permanent Dividend Fund, where revenue are generated to all Alaskans every year while keeping some of the resources to ensure the sustainability in times of crisis, as what has been faced now. Some African countries also have sovereign wealth fund, but to what extent the institutional configuration is framed in the way which will help achieve sustainable outcomes. So the eighth point is to improve the overall governance environment. So we can achieve, it is difficult to outperform in the oil and gas or mining sectors if the overall governance environment is already underperforming, because quite often governance in specific sectors will mirror governance in the overall country. So that is a critical point. And I think I really like what NRGI does in terms of identifying the enabling environment for a better governance in the natural sector. The ninth point, which was not mentioned, but I think is important, global partnership. To what extent countries from the G7, G20 will help engage in ensuring, especially related to illicit flows, that the resources are not stolen and transferred in Europe, etc., in the US, among other. I have engaged with some of the with the officials of some countries, and for them it's very clear why will they spend on cases where the resources are contributing to help their economy. So we need a better commitment of development partners beyond the official discourse and rhetoric. The final point, and I do agree with to have a project-specific approach, but beyond the project-specific approach, it's also important to have a country-specific approach, especially if you are thinking about long-term planning, because the project-specific approach will rather be a reactive process, while a country-specific will help systematically identify the different the potential, and then from there it will be possible to compare such potential with the achieved outcome. So to conclude, I would say that, and that is in reaction of one of the questions, to look at the gap on what countries expect compared to what they actually get. We have had some study. So this is one of the core goals of the natural resource portion of our domestic resource mobilization project. Mm-hmm. So, and beyond the comparison of what the country receives compared to what they get, we are looking at what the country could potentially get if they optimize the management of the known natural resources. So what revenue could be generated to finance development. Thank you.
Thank you, Landry. And I've just realized that we're talking about closing civic space, and our own civic space here in this room is starting to close in terms of time. So I'm going to skip my second round of questions and start with the audience. And if you could raise your hand and identify yourself, we'll take 2 or 3 questions at a time. Right here.
Hi, my name is Joanna Luca. I'm a counsel in the IMF. My question is for Landry, because you mentioned the judiciary. And I don't know if you're aware, but the IMF has developed or enhanced its governance policy last year. And now we're working on updating it. So for the next year or so, we'll be looking at what has worked, what hasn't worked. And one area that we're looking at is the judiciary. And we usually suggest measures that have to do with the judiciary publishing their decisions, publishing the Ministry of Justice in relevant jurisdictions, publishing the laws. We talk about the efficiency of tribunals. Are there lags in issuing sentences? Tribunals should publish information on how long those delays are, what the staffing situation is, and so on. So that's where we are right now. But if you have recommendations or a different understanding of data transparency in the judiciary, I'd be interested to know. Thank you.
In the back, in the second row.
Thank you. I am Vidyamani. I'm a fellow at DRL ILA at Department of State, the Democracy, Human Rights and Labor's Bureau, as well as a professor at University of Virginia. And as part of both roles, I work on sustainable supply chains. And when we talk about sustainable supply chains, we look at sustainable from a human rights point of view also. And when you think of human rights, it's a way to fight what we talk about inequality. And this is more an observation than an opinion. When we look at enforcing human rights, especially as part of trade agreements, we all seem to want the same thing. But there is a lot of misconception in the room of what improvement in human rights means, especially when you talk to people who are on the ground there, as well as from the government agencies in terms of either Prosper Africa program or Goa initiative, things like that, where improving human rights is one of the conditions for approving funds that would help with these initiatives. So the first question is, how do you help us understand what improving human rights would mean? How do you help us understand, how could you help us understand what human rights actually means on the ground there and improving it? The second question is, from an investment point of view, how do you measure human rights as part of the ESG performance? Because environment governance is a little easy as metrics to capture. The social aspect of it, how does human rights tie into that particular metric?
We'll take one more in the back, the last row.
Thank you. My name's Carlos Salinas. I work with Healing Bridges. We accompany indigenous communities in the Colombian Amazon. Congratulations to all of you on this really interesting panel. Oil is the number one threat to the survival of indigenous communities in the Colombian Amazon. And I need your help in maybe clearing out some of my cognitive dissonance this morning. The conversation has been fascinating about ensuring sustainability, fair revenue sharing, and other meetings of targets of sustainable development goals. I'm having a real hard time squaring that with the findings of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that says that if we don't keep it in the ground, we don't have human society or even life to count on. So I'm having a real hard time squaring that circle. How do we connect the climate emergency that luckily the young people are reminding us of, and now people on these climate strikes on Fridays now here in Washington. There's a synod going on in Rome that's been going on for weeks with the cardinals and the Pope and voices from the Amazon about the fact that our planet is on fire. How do we connect those dots between, these very interesting conversations about blockchain and ensuring, an actual good review of contracts and rooting out the corruption that is strangling human development, with the fact that if we continue to engage the fossil fuel industry, we're over?
Great. That's a great set of questions. I think, Landry, you have one around the judiciary, and you talked about horizontal accountability, and so the IMF has a new governance and anti-corruption framework. Maybe you have some thoughts on what the IMF should do with regard to judiciary. We had a question I think anybody could take a stab at answering about how do we measure human rights improvements, and then specifically, Ashok, how does human rights fit into an ESG assessment framework for investors? Also related to human rights, I think for the ambassador, how do you see the connection between human rights, for example, freedom of association, freedom of expression, freedom of protest in your country, and how does that either undermine or support the transparency and accountability agenda that you discussed? And then for all of us, I think the important question at the end was how do we connect this conversation so it doesn't appear to be tone deaf to what's happening in the world. I think that's basically the intent of the question and the cognitive dissonance that he was expressing. And Vera, I know you sit within a grant-making program that explicitly in its title is natural resources and climate change. And I know within Oxfam, we're having these conversations and with others. How do you connect this kind of agenda to the climate change agenda? So, Landry, maybe we'll start and work our way down.
Okay.
Excellent. So yeah, that is definitively a great initiative with the IMF, and I will need to look more into it to provide feedback. But one of the things that was not highlighted in your quick intervention is the time for implementation of the decision. So when decisions are made, are they actually implemented, and how long does it take to implement those decisions? Other aspect which may be more complex to quantify is also for controversial decision made by judges. What happened to those judges afterward? So are they relocated or fired? Those are some of the elements which may be included. So actually in terms of enforcement, so do we make decisions which are not implemented, or do we actually have the evidence that once the government or once the judges make decisions, they are followed? And to what extent also the executive will interfere in the decision-making process, which is supposed to be independent? Just briefly, I don't know if we don't have a lot of time, but a critical element that we have not discussed. I moderated a panel at the World Economic Forum on Africa on resource-led growth and development. So to what extent African or globally resource-rich country can use what one of my panelists said, resource blessing. Because when I spoke about resource curse, one of the panelists reacted very emotionally. I think, oh, it's a blessing, it's not a curse. And that the failure comes from the leadership in the ability of ensuring that the curse benefit the country and benefit everyone. So to what extent do we use those resources and the revenue generated by those resources to benefit the broader economy, to diversify the economy? And one of the solutions here, and I think another project also led by our colleague, Dr. Coulibaly, is the industries without smokestacks. So usually when people speak about the economic diversification or when they speak about industrialization on the continent, they think about traditional manufacturing. Where in those traditional manufacturing, so while we're focusing on that, they overlook the industries without smokestacks, where export or service export have grown 6 times faster than traditional manufacturing export in those specific industries from 1998 to 2015. So it's really important in framing the conversation to think beyond the extractive sector and to think about the transition to a more diversified economy.
Great. Ashok?
Yeah, sure. I guess a couple of things to respond to. Perhaps I'll start with the point that Vera raised about taxes and attracting investment and so forth. I think there's kind of an old paradigm of how economies work, and there's a new paradigm that's evolving. And the old paradigm pits business against civil society, for example, right? And it's sort of a zero-sum game. And I think the new paradigm that's emerging is one that we've seen I don't know exactly what it looks like right now, but we've seen hints of it from, for example, this whole trend towards ESG, with European pension funds forcing institutional investors to integrate ESG considerations into their investment decision. A second example of that is the Business Roundtable statement. Jamie Dimon and 181 CEOs said that the purpose of a corporation is not to make profits for shareholders, but to address the needs of all the stakeholders of a company. And so, so we need to move, particularly in light of the climate crisis, very quickly towards this new paradigm, as quickly as possible. And it's not a zero-sum game, but it's actually a game for all of our survival. And we, as the Emerging Markets Investors Alliance, are at the forefront of getting institutional investors on board with this new vision. I mean, we, as investors, we see our jobs as to make money for our investors, right? For all of you, pensioners and the people who hold mutual funds. But we have to see, and to do that, our view has always been that we need to focus on company or government's financials, basically. But really, to do that effectively and to make profits in the long term, we need to focus on ESG. We need to focus on the SDGs. We need to focus on, a new paradigm, basically. And so, so we are working actively to educate institutional investors about how to do this, and moving. This brings me to the point about human rights. And the way we do this as an organization, we are not the experts on climate change, and we're not the experts on human rights. We're investors who are trained. Basically, we have an MBA and more or less, and go to it, So we rely on experts. We rely on civil society. We rely on academics. We rely on people at think tanks to inform us about what the standards are. So, so I can't tell you what the human rights standards are. I'd like you to tell me what they are. And I would like you in particular to let me know how I can give me a set of standards that cut across countries, because I'm investing in well over 100 countries around the world. I want a standard that cuts across companies and industries, because I'm investing in all kinds of companies and industries. So you show me a standard that I can use, and we can then try to get investors to know about that standard and to advocate for that standard. And then more specifically to regarding the climate issue, I think that I agree completely with the point that you raised. I mean, we're kind of all standing on a ship that's thinking and talking about how to arrange the chairs in a way. But that said, there are things that we can do to, and we should do. I mean, at an institutional level, we need to pressure. You need to pressure your pension funds and your mutual funds. You need to write them letters and write blog articles, putting pressure on them to take action on the climate crisis. You need to talk to your utility companies and tell them to switch to alternative sources of energy, right? At an individual level, we can become vegan and we can start to stop our palm oil consumption. If we must fly, we can start to pay for, offset our carbon emissions. I think we need to be doing everything that we can at every level that we can.
Thank you. Vera?
How do I follow that? So I just want to know, I'm not sure if this was directed to me specifically, the question about improving human rights. I think that's a tough question. When you say improving human rights, there are 3 generations of rights. So which rights are you speaking about? And are you referring to the declarations, or are you referring to national human rights frameworks in those countries as you're measuring them? And what's your baseline? So to answer that question, I think we need more information. But in terms of what I see bubbling up, there's a lot of work on fiscal policy and human rights. The Center for Economic and Social Rights has been working on this, Tax Justice Network, there's the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, Oxfam, and so forth. So there are lots of people in this room who have been thinking about what does it mean in terms of fiscal policy and intersecting that with a rights framework to doing fiscal policy. And we have the UN declarations on human rights, and it's a question of testing those out. And I think there's if memory serves, when it comes to austerity measures that were introduced, I think it's in Spain or so, you might correct me on that, and they were able to challenge the introduction, I think it's Colombia actually, the introduction of austerity measures by, I think, the IMF and so forth, that were being pushed by the IMF on the basis of human rights. So I think I would invite you to, like, if we can get in conversation about what you mean, because there's a lot of good stuff that's happening. Are these standards? Are they accepted by the country? Are they norms? Are they being implemented? That's something we'd have to interrogate together. The question on climate change, 100% agree. And I would hope that we haven't been ignoring the sinking ship. The sinking ship, because in my organization, as Ian said, I'm in the natural resources and climate change team. So we take these issues of climate change and the current climate crisis very seriously. In my program specifically, we actually work with and support a lot of indigenous communities to advance their rights, particularly around tenure, to counter issues of climate change, recognizing that indigenous communities are the best champions of the environment, and we cannot talk about climate change without including them, and they are climate change solution holders. So I would like to think that in terms of this debate, the foundation is doing a lot already. I think what we are focusing here, if I can move away from fossil fuels, is recognizing that even if we do shift, even if we stopped oil production today, the truth of the matter is the alternative energy solutions will still require extraction. There are some countries that will continue to be mining countries. For example, the DRC. There's no getting around that. We all have cell phones. So even if we move to alternative sources, it's still a fact we have to reckon with. So I don't think it's an either or. And I think similar to Asher, I'm not a climate change expert, I'm not a scientist. We need to be led and to think together about what does it look like to move away from fossil fuels within the next 10 years. I think that what I heard is we have 12 years or it's over. So what does that mean exactly? And for countries who not just have stranded assets, but stranded countries that are new producers. What does it mean to be Kenya that just discovered oil yesterday? And they've already made they're banking on that, based on their revenue projections. Do we mean that country can no longer rely on those resources? Who gets to dictate that? What are the choices? So I think it's a complex issue from different perspectives, but it's one that we're attentive to. And if you have ideas, I'm very happy to hear that after the break. I think those are the only questions.
Great, thank you. Ambassador Yansane, so the question around human rights and its relationship to the transparency and accountability agenda and how that's playing out in Guinea. And then also if you have any thoughts on how Guinea's resource endowment can be used to help the country on an energy transition and what the climate change discussion is looking like in your country.
Yeah, I would like first to address the issue of the judiciary. I do believe that the judiciary starts with a legal framework. And today we have made a lot of effort to make sure that our legal framework is really under control. And today we are able to make public all mining contracts. Today you can have access to mining contract online. You can have access to the cadastre online. So this is the first step. The second step is the cooperation between the national judiciary and then partner judiciary. We had huge dispute in the mining sector, and we got a lot of help from the US, from Switzerland, from the UK to actually help us to go about that dispute. And today we had a lot of good result. So the judiciary, maybe locally, maybe weak, but if we have this partnership with international partners, then we may be able to achieve a meaningful outcome. Now, regarding the human right, I may say that we have different aspects. First, local content. We have to make sure that local communities are benefiting from the activities of mining companies. So mining companies in our bylaws have to make sure that they outsource part of the activities to local companies in terms of manpower or in terms of purchasing goods. So, and this could help mining companies be in better mood with the environment. The other thing is the EITI. We did put in place the EITI, and it is shared by civil society people, not by government. So, and all the report of the EITI from Guinea is made public, is discussed by civil society with, of course, government officials, and of course, the viewpoint of all stakeholders are taken into account. Now, I may not say that there have been problems. We had problems in the big mining area in the northwest regarding labor laws. We are partners with Chinese companies. At some instances, we had the feeling that the labor laws were not, let's say, applied as they should be. So there have been some conflicts. So we have been obliged to actually make sure that this conflict could be kept under control. Environment problems also erupted in the northwest area because of climate change. So the government decided to ensure that that area is becoming a special development zone, not only for mining, but trying to make sure that there is a combination of mining and other activities, agriculture, services, to ensure that there is good harmony between mining companies and then local communities. It started working, but we have a long way to go. So this is how we try to ensure that local community feel comfortable. Last but not least, we decided to put in place local development fund, and to put in that fund 15% of the revenue of the government. Of course, we have the issue of transparency in the management of that fund. We have the issue of capacity of local communities. So it is a learning curve, but we're getting there.
Great. Well, Christina, I think we're very close to time. I don't know if we have time to push past maybe one more question. So give the floor to Danny. Yeah, we're at time, so it's up to you.
Okay, so maybe just one question for the ambassador. I think you mentioned before 2011, all the deals or contracts that were made were not good. And
some of them.
No, some of them, okay. But I guess what my curiosity basically is, what in your view were really the factors behind those bad deals that were struck? You mentioned the issue of capacity. You've mentioned the issue of asymmetry. And I know when we hosted your president, one of the long laundry list of assignment he gave me was to think of ways to help Guinea with being able to level the playing field with multinational companies. So if you rank in terms of governance, capacity, asymmetric information, what were the critical top three or so factors that led to those bad deals?
Yeah.
We'll take the two and then we'll close.
Yeah, actually, because we're running out of time, I won't put you totally on the spot, but maybe I want to take this opportunity, since we're about to close this in this partnership and joint event, to recognize everybody here who's doing so much about that, and Oxfam and Brookings for the collaboration on these. These have been two absolutely fantastic panels showing great expertise. I want to encourage everybody that we all continue working together and with that use of data. There's an enormous amount of data, and he was right in pointing out during these sessions that there are still some gaps, but also Oxfam and others have an enormous amount of data. So do we at NRG. I encourage everybody to look at all our .org resources, and it was mentioned here, the resourceproject.org, resourcecontract.org, resourcedata.org, National Oil Companies Database, also another .org, and of course the Resource Governance Index. It's an enormous amount of information, and we haven't fully together tapped all what is there. Just one reflection, and if there is a minute for feedback, including from you, Ian, I think all the right buttons have been mentioned today, and with great expertise. My concern, it's not concern, but it's a challenge together in the next stage, is to linking the dots in a more concrete fashion. And I'll illustrate it just with one key topic that has come up again and again today, and that's corruption and state capture. So in a compartmentalized fashion, because we have different types of expertise, we hear about the revenue forecasting experts saying, well, we have to adjust expectations and do better and suggest to the countries that they need to manage expectations and they're not going to get all the revenues expected. Then on taxes, we say the same thing regarding taxes. Well, why are not all, but many of these countries not getting the revenues expected and not the taxes expected? Countries that have a bigger challenge in governance, corruption, and state capture get less. And we are not integrating rigorously with data the governance, corruption, and state capture factor into our technocratic, economic, fiscal, and financial model. So I would pose it, and I want the reaction to agree, because otherwise we just say on the side, oh yeah, we need to also address corruption, but this is part and parcel. It's not just mismanagement or efficiency losses and so on. It is the case. Ashok mentioned the whole issue. Why is Nigeria having to pay so much more to borrow? Well, it's a no-brainer because of the risk factor related to governance corruption. Risk-rating agencies integrate nowadays all these governance and corruption factors in ways that we have not done fully in our own field. So it's a challenge to us. And to end in this context, we have a particular challenge regarding state capture, which I'm very glad that you mentioned, and for foundations become very, very interesting that in the field, it's right to get so involved at the micro level, at the project level, what's happening with contracts, what's happening with projects, and so on. But if at the end of the day, we have success in all these troikas, payments, contract, beneficiary ownership, and it's all transparent, it will still be too late, because who shaped these rules of the game? Who shaped these contracts? How were they shaped in terms of the contracts, the payment? Who are the beneficiary owners who are not penalized according to the law if the minister is involved or other officials in a deal? We need to look of how these rules of the game are shaped, and that's what state capture is all about. So the transparency before the lawmaking process and the licensing process start is a major challenge before us that we need to get much more involved in terms of if we're going to be serious about the challenge of state capture. Otherwise, we're looking at already fait accompli and crying foul a bit too late. We don't want to be too late in the future. So that's one challenge of linking the dot of the discussion on state capture. Last but not least, about energy transition. If we don't address these very issues on governance, corruption, and state capture, then there are going to be many deals and many decisions made that are going to be very inefficient in terms of that energy transition in the future. So we need to also include it in these very models in projecting with the data for the country, the negative, what we call in economics, the negative externalities of these issues. It cannot just be the regular traditional models of showing what are the financial costs and benefits, which quote unquote are realistic. We need to fully integrate. And there I'm an economist, the economist profession has been derelict to some extent, and I think we have been calling for doing more. So we still have quite a bit of homework ahead, but this was fantastic. To panel, I wanted to thank you. I know that Ian, you want to summarize and frame too, but I couldn't help, given the richness of this panel. I want to thank also everybody.
Thanks. I know there was one question directed at you,
Yeah.
And in some ways it responds to some of the things that Danny said. So trying to differentiate between what are political problems, what are capacity problems, what are technical problems, what are corruption problems, and what were the factors that led to the bad deals that you were uncovering when the government came into power?
Weak institutions. Weak institutions, for me, is the main problems in the mining sector. Usually, people contend that investors are going to countries where there is an enabling environment. But unfortunately, a lot of investors go to countries that are unstable when it comes to natural resources. I've been working in DRC, Congo, and that was the case. And when I was there, the mood was to review the mining contract that were signed during the turmoil of Congo. Likewise, in Guinea, we had an ailing president for almost 10 years, and during that period, a lot of deals were signed. So, political instability, weak institutions, weak legal framework are key for corruption because there is no standards. So every project was a standalone project without any reference to any mining code. So political instability, weak legal framework, weak capacity, corruption. I don't know if I responded to your question.
So with that, I would want to thank all of the collaborators and all of our panelists for joining us today, and for the audience for being patient and also participating. I think I'll leave you with a few thoughts. One is that an academic years ago wrote a book about development in Lesotho, and he titled it The Anti-Politics Machine. I don't know if anybody has read this book, but it made a big impact on me. And I think in terms of the transparency movement, we always have to check ourselves that it's not an anti-politics machine, because these are issues that are fundamentally political. They're fundamentally about power. And while we need to be technically competent and credible, civil society, we need to be extremely politically savvy. And I think some of the cases that you saw this morning showed the ways that we're able to connect that technical credibility, for example, in Malawi, with the political savvy to find solutions for your own local context. And so with that kind of combination and that kind of framework, I think we can make progress, but it is going to be difficult. As my colleague Kathleen Brophy said in our learning workshop earlier this week, the corrupt actors are constantly evolving and adapting, and we have to adapt with them so that we're not talking about, yesterday's game, but we're talking about the game of the future and engaging on that playing field in really smart ways. So thank you very much, and look forward to continuing the discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.